All right, guys, topic for this video is connective tissues. And I realize this may not be the most exciting topic ever, but it's important for a lot of other topics in A&P. It'll carry forward, so let's just try to knock it out and simplify it as much as we can. All right, the idea here is connective tissues are exactly what they sound like. They're used to link structures in the body to each other. So common examples are tendons and ligaments. Skin is primarily a connective tissue. Bones, even blood is considered a connective tissue. So when we break this down, all you really need to think about is what are the cell types that we find, and then what are the protein fibers that it contains, because the proteins are really what give a connective tissue its structure, its strength, its resilience. So cell types to look for. When you look at connective tissues under a microscope, most of what you see is going to be fibroblasts. Right? And if you pick the words apart, fibro just means protein fiber, and the suffix blast in medical terminology just means anything that creates something. So a fibroblast is just a cell that creates protein fibers. Right? So when you look at these tissues in a scope, you can pretty much assume that 99% of the cells you see, most of the time, are fibroblasts that are secreting the proteins that actually make up the connective tissue itself. Right? The other common cell types, macrophages and mast cells, are both derived from the immune system. Macrophages leave the blood and stay in connective tissue permanently. They're looking for infections, searching for bacteria, viruses, damaged human cells, anything that might need to be cleaned up and destroyed. And mast cells are regulating inflammation. Inflammation gets a bad rap, but remember, it's an important part of the healing process. So if you strain or partially tear a tendon or a ligament or any connective tissue, mast cells are secreting chemicals that trigger the inflammatory response, which is really the only way that your immune system knows that healing even needs to start. So even though we try to get rid of inflammation a lot, remember, it serves a purpose, and so those cells have a vital role. So for those protein fibers that fibroblasts are secreting, they come in a couple major categories. Most of the stronger, denser connective tissues you see, like tendons and ligaments, are made out of a protein called collagen. And there are a lot of different types of collagen, but they have one thing in common. The fibers tend to be very thick, very strong, and they give a tissue what we call tensile strength. Tensile meaning it's able to resist tension or stretching. So think ropes, chains, cables, anything that you can pull on and not have it snap or break, that has tensile strength. That's the opposite of compression strength. That would be more like a bone, where you can squeeze it, stack a lot of weight on it, and expect it not to squish. All right, so in this picture, these fibers are pseudocolored. The very, very thick gray ones that you see sort of wavy in the background, those are collagen fibers, very, very heavily compacted into, again, tendons, ligaments, the dermis of the skin. Even bones contain very high amounts of collagen. All right. And these reticular fibers are basically a thinner, lighter version of collagen. You'll find them in internal organs like, lungs, the exterior of organs like intestines or stomach, places where you don't need nearly as much strength, but we still have to resist tension in some way. Lastly, elastic fibers, those are the ones that are pseudo-colored yellow on the slide. And if you zoom in close, you can see that those elastic fibers almost look like they have coils in them, like they're all bound up. The reason for that is those coils in the elastic fibers act like molecular springs, so that when you stretch them, it really is like stretching a spring or a rubber band. They build up tension and they want to snap back. This is why most connective tissues, skin is an easy place to see it, why if you stretch the tissue and then let go, they'll snap back, right? That way you can deform the tissue and expect that it'll take back its original shape after you let go again, right? So in the connective tissues we're going to see, they're primarily made up of just different proportions of these types of connective tissue. So let's go through some examples. Right, the first one, traditional connective tissues are broken down into the categories loose or dense, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This is loose connective tissue because the fibers aren't packed very tightly. Right, so pay attention to these. When you look at the histology slides, any of these circles that you see that are in dark purple, That dark purple color is always a DNA stain. Those are the nuclei of fibroblasts, right? They're what are secreting the proteins that we see in the background, right? So all of these threads, the darker purple ones that you're seeing, those are primarily collagen, right? And anytime you see something that looks like it's a little bit lighter colored or it has any sort of coiled structure to it, like this lighter colored one here, this is probably elastin, okay? So this loose connective tissue is generally found around internal organs that don't produce or respond to a whole lot of stress, right? So when we say wraps and cushions organs, you would find this on the exterior of organs like GI organs, liver, spleen, lungs. Consider it the external covering. It almost looks like tissue paper if you dissect it out of a live organ. All right. So areolar tissue is generally external. Loose reticular connective tissue is generally internal, right? So this is forming an internal skeleton in organs where the cells in that organ need to be able to move around, right? So you typically find this in what we call lymphoid organs, which are lymph nodes, bone marrow, or spleen. The thing that those organs have in common is that they are either filled with white blood cells or with the stem cells that are eventually going to become white blood cells. So in this slide, all of these, they're so dark purple, they almost appear black. But all of these nuclei in the background, those are actually not fibroblasts. Most of those are white blood cells because this came out of a lymph node. And the idea is those white blood cells need to be able to move around. We can't lock them in place and connect them to each other with intercellular junctions because they have to be able to leave and enter the blood if there's an infection, right? So these wavy lines that you see in the background, that's the actual connective tissue. And so we say it's an internal skeleton because it's giving a framework to the organ. You know, a lymph node or a spleen is still very soft, but it's preventing these white blood cells from just falling into a puddle because we can't connect them to each other. So let's make this network of reticular collagen fibers and then let the white blood cells move around internally, almost like they're moving through a building. And the reticular fibers are like the boards that are holding the building in place. Okay, dense connective tissues. The first type, we call this dense regular for the very boring reason that if you look at the way the protein fibers are organized, notice how they're all running roughly in parallel to each other, right? You don't see any fibers running this way. Doesn't happen. The reason for that is you find dense regular connective tissue primarily in tendons or ligaments. And if you think about the function of a tendon or a ligament, they only get pulled in one direction. Whichever direction the muscle pulls when it contracts, that's the direction you want to run your protein fibers, kind of like a rope. And so dense regular connective tissues are very, very much like ropes. They almost always attach to bones. Remember, tendons are muscle to bone and ligaments are bone to bone. And it is just very densely packed collagen. And all of these long, skinny, oblong nuclei belong to the fibroblasts that made that tissue. Right? The reason they're so long and thin is because they get squeezed and compacted when a muscle contracts or a joint moves, and the connective tissue fibers press on them and squeeze them and squish them. All right, dense irregular connective tissue, that is this, right? So this slide came from skin. This dark purple tissue up here is the epidermis. Everything down here is the dermis. And the dermis is where you find a lot of dense irregular connective tissue. All of these wavy fibers in the background, notice how they're not organized in parallel like the previous slide. They're crisscrossed every different direction. The reason for that is your skin, right, and joint capsules is another example. Those are organs that don't just get pulled in one direction like a tendon. They might get pulled and twisted on in any possible direction. So we have to weave the fibers every different way imaginable. Otherwise, they would just splay apart if you pulled them in the wrong direction. Okay, so we've got dense regular and irregular. This is dense elastic. Notice the coils, right? These fibers that you see in the background very much look like springs, like they've got a coil structure to them. That's because when you pull on them, they're going to stretch out, right? Exactly like a spring or a rubber band would. And so you find dense elastic connective tissue mainly in large blood vessels and in air passages in the lungs. The reason is when your blood pressure goes up, the aorta and its major branches have to be able to stretch to accommodate the increased volume. So every time your heart beats and contracts and forces blood into the aorta, we expect that connective tissue to stretch out like a rubber band and then snap back. If you ever dissect a heart that hasn't been preserved, you can stick your finger down in the aorta and pull on the wall of it, and it'll be stretchy, just like a very thick rubber band would be. Okay, next set of connective tissues are types of cartilage. So consider cartilage like a subcategory within connective tissue. And the first type, hyaline cartilage, looks like this. The easy way to recognize it is the extracellular space in between these cells looks very smooth and polished. And places you see this, the ribs are held to the sternum via costal cartilage. That's a type of hyaline. The rings around your trachea are hyaline cartilage. The septum in the nose, the nasal septum, is hyaline. The caps of joints, synovial joints, are hyaline cartilage. And the only thing to change on here is the cells that you see, we give them a unique name. The prefix chondro always means something to do with cartilage, and cyte, like cytoplasm, is always cell. So chondrocytes really just mean cartilage cells. It's the same idea as fibroblasts, just unique name because it's specific to cartilage tissue. All right. So pretty much all of this extracellular space that you're seeing is still made of collagen, just like the other connective tissues. We're just packing it and organizing it in a slightly different way. So the tissue is a little bit harder and firmer. If you push on your ribs right next to the sternum, you can feel that they flex a little bit. It's not quite as hard as bone, but it's way more rigid than a tendon or a ligament would be. So that's hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage is really similar in a lot of ways, but slightly different. So really similar to hyaline. You can even see those similarly shaped chondrocytes. They're a bit harder to see because the tissue's a little bit darker stained purple. The only difference is they're primarily filled with elastic fibers instead of collagen. So if you look at it from a zoomed out view, this elastic cartilage looks a bit more stringy, right? The stringy appearance comes because the elastic fibers are coiled. Remember, they're like springs. So don't get this confused with dense elastic connective tissue that we saw in blood vessels. This is cartilage, still has those elastic fibers, so it has similar properties, but it's a little bit harder. The best example of this is the tissue in your external ear or pinna that gives it its rigidity. So if you bend the outside of your ear and pinch it together, let go, the snapback is coming from those elastic fibers. Okay. Fibrocartilage, very different than the other two. Instead of giving tensile strength the way that hyaline cartilage and elastic do, fibrocartilage is much better at being compressed. So it resists compressive force. Best example of this, anywhere where you're putting a huge amount of weight or load on a joint. So intervertebral discs are the best example of this. If you took a disc, when you hear of someone rupturing or herniating a disc, if you put it under a microscope, this is the tissue that's holding that disc together. They form rings so that when your vertebrae smash down on each other, that gives you a bit of a buffer like a cushion to prevent bones from rubbing together and compressing spinal nerves. Okay, so this is still collagen tissue, but instead of being sort of rigid and hard to bend the way hyaline is, it's relatively soft. It's just very good at absorbing a lot of compression. Okay, bone tissue. Makes perfect sense that bone fits under the category of connective, and this should be obvious, but bone is much, much harder than any other connective tissue. Most of it is one of two things. It's either calcium phosphate, that's the calcified matrix part of it. That's what's giving bones their hardness, their compression strength. The rest of it is collagen, just like other connective tissues. And so all that collagen is giving bones a little bit of flexibility. If you take a bone that's not preserved and is still like recently living and start bending and twisting on it, it will actually bend a lot more than you would expect before it snaps. That ability to bend and absorb tensile strength, that's the collagen. All right, structures that you should pay attention to. Each of these large round rings, they almost look like a tree stump would be if you cut it off. That entire large unit is called an osteon. Anytime you see the prefix ost, O-S-T, that means something to do with bone. This smaller ring structure in the middle, we call a central canal. And the central canal is where you find blood vessels and nerves, right? Bones are not dead. They're living tissue. They need a blood supply. So you have arteries and veins running up and down that central canal. Okay. Now, these sort of oddly shaped blobs that you see all around the osteon, those are bone cells, right? You would call those osteocytes. And the nutrients somehow have to get from the central canal to the osteocyte. And so you see all of these very tiny little passageways, right, radiating out from the central canal towards those osteocytes. Those structures are called canaliculi, right? Think of them like mini canals that are transporting nutrients out, waste products back to exchange with the blood vessels that are in your central canal. Okay, blood. This one's easy, obviously easy to recognize. The vast majority of cells on the slide are red blood cells. The only ones on here that are white blood cells are the ones that have the darker purplish blue staining. The reason for that is white blood cells have a nucleus, right? Red blood cells don't. And so red blood cells just appear pale pink because they're effectively just packed with hemoglobin. Their entire job is to transport oxygen. This is a great example of trade-offs between, costs and benefits in A&P. We don't put a nucleus in red blood cells because a nucleus is just filled with DNA, and DNA doesn't transport oxygen. And so it would be a waste of your heart's energy and your blood volume if you put a nucleus in every one of these red blood cells. They would dramatically increase in size. And so if you added a nucleus, you would get a higher blood volume, your heart would have to work harder, your blood vessels would have to be bigger, and you wouldn't get any oxygen transport out of it. And so it's better off to just remove the nucleus. The downside is without a nucleus, that means no transcription, no translation, no proteins being made. These cells can't repair themselves. And so the downside is they have a very short half-life, they die quickly, and you constantly have to make new red blood cells from your bone marrow all the time. All right. Okay, muscle tissue. I combine these because muscle tissue comes in three varieties, skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Skeletal muscle is exactly what it sounds like, muscles that move the skeleton. So anything that's attaching to bones, moving joints. There are some exceptions, right? Muscles that move, like facial expression muscles, those are skeletal. Muscles involved in swallowing, pelvic floor, that's all skeletal. We typically say that skeletal muscles are voluntary. And we also say that they're striated, right? Striated means this banding pattern that you see. This will make more sense later on in A&P when you get to the details of muscle tissue. But those bands of protein are where the actual contraction is happening. And if you could turn this into a live video and see a muscle contracting under a microscope, you would see those bands spread apart and then shrink back together, almost like an accordion when the muscle contracts and relaxes. All right, smooth muscle gets its name because it is not striated, right? It's also involuntary. So you can't control smooth muscle voluntarily, but obviously your brain and your endocrine system definitely can. So you generally find smooth muscles lining any internal organ. So around the intestines or stomach and the GI tract, surrounding the bronchioles in your lungs, the urinary bladder or ureter, almost any hollow internal organ lined with smooth muscle. Okay. Cardiac, exactly like it sounds, only found in the heart. And this one is striated much like skeletal muscle, but it is obviously involuntary. You can't voluntarily control the rate that your heart contracts at. And the other difference you'll notice is you can tell the difference between skeletal and cardiac because skeletal muscles come organized as fibers. They look really, really long, incredibly large cells. And because they're so large, notice there's more than one nucleus per cell. So you say they're multinucleated, whereas cardiac muscle cells are not. Just like normal cells, they only have one nucleus per cell. They're spaced out evenly. That's the easy way to tell the difference between them. Okay, couple odds and ends. Nervous tissue gets its own separate category, right? So it doesn't fit into connective, it doesn't fit into muscle, it's its own thing. And there's a lot of neuro in A&P, and so we're going to get into details on this a lot later. For right now, just remember that you have two major cell types, right? These cells that look like they're relatively large, little nucleus in the middle, and those cells are the ones that have all of these processes coming off of them. It's hard to see where they connect, right? Because we're looking at this two-dimensionally. But neurons are big, complicated cells that have long processes coming off of them. You can see it more clearly on this slide, right? The smaller ones we call dendrites. They receive information from other neurons that aren't being drawn here. And then this guy, your axon, is sending information out of that neuron down the line to form synapses with other cells, right? So neurons are the cells doing all the signaling and communicating. Any other cell that you see in the background here, any of those guys, we call those glia or glial cells. Those are effectively supporting cells of the nervous system that control the metabolic environment of the brain, blood-brain barrier. They're basically supporting cells to neurons. Okay, and last tissue type that we're going to go over is adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is mainly a form of energy storage, but remember, it also can be used for insulation. It's the reason that we put a layer of it under the skin. And it can also be used as a cushion, right? Your spinal cord has some adipose tissue surrounding it. Your kidneys have pockets of adipose tissue. It's relatively soft and squishy, and so it makes a nice shock absorber to protect organs. Right. One thing you'll notice if you zoom in, these cells look like they're hollow, like they're almost empty. The entire cell, or almost all of it anyway, is bound up by one gigantic lipid or fat droplet. And I'm writing TG because that's abbreviation for triglycerides. That's just the form that humans and all other animals, for that matter, store fat as. And so if a person eats more calories than they're burning through, you'll add triglycerides to this adipose tissue, and these cells will swell and get larger. And if you eat a little bit less than you're burning, the cells will shrink. And so they're almost like a balloon that can expand and then contract. In adults, these cells don't divide. It's very hard to divide with that giant blob of triglyceride inside. And so each swell shrinks or expands, but you don't really divide and get new cells after childhood. All right. Okay, hope this was helpful. This concludes tissue. So the next video, we're going to jump into skin, which goes along with this pretty well because a lot of the tissues that we saw in the section are going to be found in skin. And so it's a chance to see them actually functioning inside of an organ.